They called it the engine that should have saved Baldwin, but instead, it became a symbol of their downfall. For over a century, the Baldwin Locomotive Works was a giant. Their steam engines were icons of American power and progress. But when the tide turned and the diesel revolution began, Baldwin hesitated. That hesitation cost them everything. At the heart of this story is one machine, the Baldwin 608A. Built in the heat of the steam-to-diesel transition, it was supposed to prove Baldwin could survive in a new era. Instead, it became a reminder of the company's decline and of the decisions that doomed one of America's greatest locomotive builders. For more than 100 years, Baldwin Locomotive Works was a titan. Founded in the 1830s, it grew into one of the most respected builders of steam locomotives in the world. From the mid-19th century through the 1920s, Baldwin steam engines became the backbone of American industry. They hauled coal out of Appalachia, timber from the Northwest, and grain across the Midwest. When Americans thought of railroads, they thought of Baldwin, and Baldwin thought steam would last forever. By the late 1920s, however, a new challenger was creeping onto the rails, the diesel-electric locomotive. At first, these machines looked unimpressive, boxy, noisy, smaller than the great steam giants. They seemed like toys compared to Baldwin's massive steam locomotives. But behind their plain exteriors was something steam could never match: efficiency. Diesels could run longer without refueling, required far less maintenance, and didn't need the huge support system of water towers, coaling stations, and servicing crews that steam demanded. Companies like General Electric, Alco, and especially a small but ambitious firm called Electromotive Corporation were already experimenting with diesel-electric designs. They saw the writing on the wall. Railroads wanted engines that could do more with less. And diesel promised exactly that. But Baldwin didn't see it that way. The company leadership considered diesel a fad, a temporary distraction, maybe good for small switchers working in rail yards, but no threat to the big power locomotives that kept America's freight moving. Steam was king, and Baldwin intended to keep it that way. They doubled down on what they knew best, ignoring the warning signs all around them. Then came disaster. In 1935, Baldwin declared bankruptcy. The company reorganized and survived, but it came out of the process weaker, poorer, and with little ability to invest in new technology. At the very moment Baldwin needed to innovate, they were strapped for cash. Meanwhile, Electromotive was acquired by General Motors, rebranded as EMD, and backed with nearly unlimited resources. While Baldwin clung to steam, EMD poured money into refining its diesel engines. By the late 1930s, EMD's sleek diesel streamliners were making headlines across the country. Railroads that tried them realized they weren't novelties at all. They were the future. Baldwin, once the undisputed leader, was now at risk of being left behind. The company entered the 1940s still dominant in steam, but dangerously behind in diesel. And when they finally decided to act, their answer was a machine they believed could close the gap: the Baldwin 608A. When Baldwin finally embraced diesel power in the 1940s, they did it in classic Baldwin fashion: big, bold, and heavy. Their showcase engine was the Baldwin 608A, the company's strongest attempt to prove it belonged in the diesel era. The name told the story. Each of its 8 cylinders displaced 608 cubic inches, making the engine a true brute. In total, it could deliver anywhere from 1,000 to 1,600 horsepower, depending on configuration. That made it suitable for road freight locomotives, where Baldwin hoped to compete directly with EMD and Alco. On paper, the 608A looked like it could get Baldwin back in the race. Technically, the design was ambitious. Baldwin engineers chose a 4-stroke design, which in theory produced more power for its size. They also experimented with turbocharging to improve performance and fuel efficiency. And as you'd expect from a company famous for rugged steam locomotives, the 608A was built strong: big castings, heavy components, and a reputation for toughness. But the real test wasn't the blueprint, it was performance on the rails. And that's where things got complicated. The 608A had strengths, but also serious weaknesses. It was large, heavy, and mechanically complex. Its fuel economy was poor compared to EMD's 567 series engines, which were smaller but far more efficient. Worse, reliability became an issue. Railroads that bought Baldwin diesels often complained of breakdowns, difficult maintenance, and higher operating costs. In an industry where time and reliability meant everything, this was a major problem. Still, not all was lost. Some smaller and mid-sized railroads gave Baldwin's diesels a chance. They were often less brand loyal and more willing to experiment. In certain applications like yard switching and short-haul freight, the 608A locomotives could perform decently. Crews sometimes praised their raw pulling power, and Baldwin's heavy construction gave them a sturdy feel. But when railroads compared Baldwin's engines to those from EMD, the difference was stark. The EMD 567 was lighter, more fuel efficient, and most importantly, far more reliable. A Baldwin might spend more time in the shop while an EMD kept running. Over time, that reliability gap meant Baldwin couldn't keep up, no matter how much horsepower they put on the spec sheet. The 608A became a symbol of Baldwin's broader struggle. It showed that Baldwin still knew how to build powerful machines, but also exposed their inability to adapt quickly and match the practical advantages of their rivals. Instead of being Baldwin's comeback story, the 608A became another reminder of why the company was slipping further behind. World War II arrived at a critical moment for Baldwin. The company was still reeling from its late start in diesel development, but the war created opportunities it could not ignore. With steel, fuel, and manpower rationed, the U.S. government controlled locomotive production tightly. Most builders were ordered to focus on proven steam designs, but there was also limited demand for diesel switchers and military locomotives. Baldwin, like other manufacturers, received wartime contracts for diesels. These were mostly smaller engines used for switching yards, military bases, and short freight runs. In these niche roles, Baldwin's 608A-powered locomotives saw service. For Baldwin, it was a lifeline. It allowed them to build experience with diesel technology while keeping their factories busy during wartime. But the real revolution began after the war ended. The late 1940s brought the great diesel boom. Railroads, finally free from wartime restrictions, rushed to modernize their fleets. And leading the charge was EMD. Their FT freight locomotive had already proven itself during the war, hauling long trains more efficiently than steam ever could. After the war, EMD followed up with the legendary F units, sleek, reliable, and backed by GM's vast resources. These engines became the face of modern American railroading. Baldwin tried to answer. They introduced a series of road locomotives powered by the 608A. On paper, the specs looked good: competitive horsepower ratings, heavy-duty construction, and models tailored for freight service. Baldwin hoped to capture a share of the booming market. But performance in the field told a different story. Railroads quickly discovered that Baldwin's locomotives were difficult to maintain. Parts weren't standardized across models, meaning repairs were often slow and expensive. Crews complained about frequent breakdowns. Shops found the 608A engines complicated compared to the simpler, more reliable designs from EMD. What's worse was the inconsistency. One Baldwin might run well for months, while another, built to the same design, was constantly sidelined. Railroads hated that kind of uncertainty. They needed fleets of locomotives that behaved the same way, and EMD delivered exactly that. Baldwin did not. As the 1950s began, the market's verdict was clear. EMD dominated. Alco held a respectable share. Baldwin, once the giant of steam, was fighting just to stay relevant. The wartime lifeline had delayed the reckoning, but the post-war diesel boom revealed the truth. Baldwin was out of step with the industry's future. But all of this didn't happen overnight. The tower crashed after repeated blows. The first mistake was underestimating diesel. For decades, Baldwin believed steam would remain the backbone of American railroading. They dismissed early diesels as a passing fad. That assumption cost them valuable years of research and development. By the time Baldwin realized diesel was here to stay, EMD had already established dominance with proven, reliable designs. The second mistake was their failure to compete on the basics. EMD understood that railroads wanted powerful locomotives as well as reliability, simplicity, and easy maintenance. That's why EMD standardized parts across its models. A mechanic could service an EMD unit quickly, often using the same parts as another locomotive in the fleet, whereas Baldwin offered engines that were mechanically complex and inconsistent. Each model seemed to require unique components, making maintenance more of a headache than it should have been. Third, Baldwin's reputation began to suffer. Railroads talk, and word spread quickly when engines underperformed. Experimental locomotives like the RP-210, which was a lightweight passenger diesel built in the mid-1950s, turned out to be unreliable, even embarrassing. Instead of rebuilding trust, these ventures damaged it further. Once a railroad lost confidence in a builder, winning it back was almost impossible. Finally, Baldwin's financial position remained weak throughout this period. The bankruptcy of 1935 had left deep scars. Even after reorganizing, Baldwin never had the cash reserves needed to innovate aggressively. Developing new diesel technology required sustained investment, and Baldwin simply couldn't match the resources of General Motors or even Alco. They were always playing catch-up with too little funding, too late in the game. Together, these missteps formed a trap Baldwin could not escape. They had the history, the name, and the engineering tradition, but none of that mattered when railroads needed dependable, cost-effective locomotives. Baldwin clung to old ways, stumbled in execution, and undermined its own credibility. By the early 1950s, the damage was clear. Baldwin wasn't leading the industry anymore. They were barely surviving while competitors seized the future. The mistakes weren't isolated. They were systemic, and they pushed Baldwin further down a path toward an inevitable end. By the early 1950s, Baldwin was running out of road. For more than a century, the company had been the gold standard of steam locomotives. But the diesel revolution was moving faster than anyone could have imagined, and Baldwin was already years behind. Railroads were buying diesels in bulk, betting on efficiency, simplicity, and long-term reliability. And when they compared Baldwin's offerings to those of its rivals, the difference was impossible to ignore. The Baldwin 608A wasn't a terrible engine. In fact, when it ran well, it showed flashes of real promise. It was rugged, it was powerful, and it had Baldwin's trademark heavy engineering behind it. But in the world of railroads, where every minute of downtime meant lost money, sometimes good was the same as never good enough. The 608A suffered from quirks and breakdowns, and Baldwin lacked the resources to refine it quickly. Meanwhile, competitors like EMD were pulling ahead. EMD's units came with standardized parts, dependable service, and reputations for running day after day with minimal fuss. Railroads trusted EMD, and that trust meant Baldwin's position eroded with every passing year. Baldwin had missed the diesel wave when it first rose in the 1930s, and by the time they dove in, the market had already taken sides. Their late start meant they were scrambling to compete in an arena where loyalty, reputation, and long-term support mattered just as much as horsepower. By 1956, Baldwin couldn't hold on any longer. After decades of dominance, the company stopped building locomotives altogether. It was the end of an era. The once mighty Baldwin name, synonymous with American steam power, had become a casualty of the diesel age. And the 608A, it became the symbol of that collapse. Not because it was a complete failure, but because it was the wrong product at the wrong time. It embodied Baldwin's hesitation, their slow embrace of diesel, and their inability to match the streamlined efficiency of EMD. Rail historians often ask, what if? What if Baldwin had jumped into diesel earlier? What if they had invested heavily in refining the 608A before their rivals captured the market? Those questions will never be answered. What we know is this: by the mid-1950s, Baldwin was finished, and the 608A was left as the mechanical marker of their downfall. Today, the Baldwin 608A lives on in a way Baldwin never could have imagined. A handful of locomotives survive, tucked away in railway museums and historical societies. For rail fans and historians, these engines are more than static displays of metal and machinery. Standing beside one of these locomotives, you can feel the weight of Baldwin's engineering culture. The machines are massive, overbuilt, and unapologetically heavy-duty, hallmarks of a company that made its name in steam. When one of the few surviving 608s is fired up, its deep mechanical roar has a kind of raw power that connects the present to Baldwin's lost past. But the 608A story carries a lesson. Baldwin proved that building a tough engine wasn't enough. In a changing market, reliability, standardization, and adaptability mattered just as much. EMD figured this out early, and it's why they thrived. Baldwin, with its attachment to tradition and slower pace of innovation, never caught up. Among railfans, the 608A has become almost legendary. It's not the star of the show like an EMD 567 or ALCO 244, but it has a mystique of its own. To some, it represents rugged American engineering at its finest. To others, it's the tragic symbol of what happens when innovation doesn't keep pace with reality. That dual identity, part pride, part tragedy, is why people still care about the 608A today. Visit any rail museum that has one on display, and you'll see it. Kids staring up in awe, hobbyists taking pictures from every angle, and old railroaders shaking their heads, remembering the struggles and the potential. The 608A is still here because its story is bigger than Baldwin. It's about how entire industries can turn in a heartbeat and how companies rise or fall depending on whether they adapt. Now, Baldwin might have gone from locomotive production, but the sound of a Baldwin 608A still lingers in history. Not as famous as an EMD, not as beloved as an ALCO, but haunting in its own way. For those who've heard one, it's unforgettable. Now, if stories like Baldwin's still speak to you, there's more history waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to the channel, share this journey with others, and leave your thoughts below.